Jim O'Neill, former chairman, Goldman Sachs Asset Management, welcome and thank you for coming to speak to the Asia Scotland Institute. You've retired now, and it's over 10 years since you famously coined the term BRIC to group the emerging economies of Brazil, Russia, India and China together. What was your thinking when you did that, and how has that evolved over the past decade or so?
And at the same time, by coincidence, the terrible tragedy of 9/11 just took place with the bombings and all the rest of it in New York and Washington. I happened to be in one of the buildings 2 days before, so it was quite a big impact for me in a personal sense. But through the horror, I sort of read into that a sort of strange thought that for globalization to thrive, it probably could no longer be as it was progressing, just a version of Americanization, that we'd had the previous decade more and more that globalization was Americanization. And I came to the conclusion that that was no longer sustainable, and that if we're going to have globalization, we had a much more complex world in which all these countries would be part of, because they had large populations and they were trying to engage in world trade. And so that was the core of it. Nearly 12 years on, which it will be by September, it's all, until recently, progressed way bigger and way more than I would have dreamt of at the time.
And some people do say that the BRICS may be stumbling a little bit at the moment. I mean, what are your thoughts on where these economies move from here and what's been happening?
Well, by and large, I would say that those kind of comments, some of which have been around for the past year or so, are a little bit naive. Because people are judging now by the standards of that first decade, but even I was significantly outbeaten by my expectations with what actually happened. And so anybody that really looks at those places closely wouldn't have dreamt that they'd carry on the same way as they did the first decade. So some slowing was pretty likely, and in fact for this decade I've assumed, as I'll show in this meeting, that they would slow. And so by and large, a lot of it is not a big deal to me yet, because especially China is in line with what I've been assuming. That said, ironically, and contrary to another dilemma for the West, is that the two places of the four which are most disappointing are the two democracies. It's really Brazil and India. China has only slowed because the government has deliberately tried to slow it, and it's actually still faster than I've assumed, decade to date. And Russia's pretty close to what I've assumed. It's really Brazil and India that have been disappointing, and they have been. So they need to do things to get their economies stronger again and undertake further policy changes.
And what sort of things?
Well, it differs in each. I was actually in India for less than a day, about 2 weeks ago, meeting the rather controversial character, Mr. Modi, who may head up the BJP in the next election. And I was asked to present to a group as bigger than in this room, actually, on the 10 things that India needs to do to reach its potential. And it ranges from having good governance as opposed to just large governments, to things like trying to get more engaged in global markets, particularly foreign direct investment. And there's many things. India, in many ways, has more than the rest put together to do to reach its potential. I think in Brazil's case, in some ways, these riots, I think, are perhaps a good sign. I think it needs to carry on where it was going. The past 18 months, the government that's come in after Lula has sort of tried to do a bit too much of a China. Ironically, when China's trying to do less of a China, i.e. using the state to manufacture growth, which is what Dilma has done a lot of, isn't what is going to help them, and people can see that, and they equate big government with waste, and Brazilian people want better.
Is there such a thing as a BRIC model of development that has emerged, and are there other countries, other economies sort of coming up in the wake of the main BRIC nations that we should be looking out for and taking note of, especially in Asia?
Yeah. I don't know if there is a BRIC model, but I do find myself often thinking that South Korea may be a model for other Asian countries, and actually maybe for many countries in the world. South Korea, quite why we call South Korea an emerging economy still, as business, certainly investing business people do, is a bit beyond me. South Korea's wealth today is nearly as high as that of a G7 country. And with that, it's the only country in the world of a vaguely large population, let's say 45 to 50 million, the only country in my lifetime that has seen its wealth go from that equivalent to an African country to that close to a G7 country. So with it being the only one, that suggests that they've done things that others can learn from. And I think, particularly given the important role of the state in that sense, it is something that many other Asian economies, including China and India, can learn some things from.
What about the relationship between the West and other so-called advanced economies and these emergent economies and the ones that may be following on behind them?
Yeah.
How do you feel that the two are related? Are we adapting and aware enough to the concerns of these economies?
I think we're in a very difficult stage, and the simple answer to your question is no, we're not adapting in the West quickly enough at all. As I'm going to show here, if you look at global GDP for the past decade, the decade we're in, even with their slower growth, they're generating still most of the positive growth that's going on in the world, and they're becoming much bigger of it, a bigger part of it by the week. 2011, the 4 BRIC countries between them created another Italy in 1 year. China creates another Cyprus every week. And yet these countries still don't have much of a say in global governance. We treat them as still very much second class. We dictate to them, or we try to, on how they should live their societies. They don't really want that. And what it suggests to me is we still need to get a more fairer and more optimal state of economic governance globally than we have. Even with weaker growth, China's impact on the world is getting bigger and bigger. I'm assuming this decade China grows by 7.5%. Decades so far, it's nearer 8.5%. And at 7.5%, that's equivalent to the US growing by 4%, which the US has never done in a decade since I've been born. So if the US was growing by 4%, everybody would be going, wow. And China growing to 7.5%, everybody's going, oh dear. And so at the core of it, people have got to get their heads around that. And if China grows by 7.5% this decade, by the end of it, it will be as big as the US is today in US dollars. Their wealth will be twice what it is. And there'll be more and more economic and everything else with the importance of China in all aspects of our life. And there are so many things that we've got to get our heads around here in the UK, including not telling China about what it should do about a whole host of things, including the Dalai Lama, for example. They're not going to listen to us about that. If we want to do a lot of business with them and engage with them for our own benefit, we have got to find a way of accepting them on their terms rather than just presuming everybody ultimately wants to live just like we do, because they don't. But to help that, we need to have a G20, which is in some ways one of the few things that has come out of the appearance of the BRICS, although it took a crisis to do it. But we need to have a G20 that includes proper weight for these guys and not just some kind of add-on. Within it, maybe a revamped G7 group of countries in which it's just not developed countries and ones of a declining GDP. We need to give space to China in particular. And maybe ultimately even more weight for these guys in the United Nations, certainly in the IMF and World Bank, and so on and so on.
Today you're going to be speaking to a mixture of people, business people, many students as well. What would be your sort of final takeaway that you would like them to go away with this evening, and to anybody watching?
My final takeaway is to have an open mind. I mean, the thing at the core of the BRICS that I said to you at the start is it took one of the, if not one of, the worst events of my life to open my mind to this. And I never realized weeks before that I would be thinking that way. So And the whole process has changed my way of behaviour and thinking, and I encourage everybody else to be that way. And the world is not always as it was, and I think for people from my generation, it's a particular challenge. I'm guessing a good half of the audience here are going to be students, and hopefully, and it should be probably easier for them because their minds won't have been influenced so much by the kind of things that have happened during the lives of those of us of my generation. So that will be probably my main message.
Jim O'Neill, thank you very much.